Hey y'all, and welcome back to my channel. In this tutorial we are going to make this bubble drip Halloween tumbler. We are going to start out with a 22-ounce cafe from the Steel Magnolia. Now this is a true 22 with a cafe dome lid. You can purchase them separately, which is what I normally do because I want to be able to give my customers an option between a regular lid and the dome lid. I have a pattern vinyl from our latest Brittany bundle from Gracefully Created. And since this is a tapered tumbler, I am just wrapping the vinyl around the tumbler and marking off where I can trim the bottom. And then I'm going to wrap it around and trim off the edges. I'm going to go ahead and get my vinyl trimming tool ready from Kimmy Page Boutique. She now has a half spacer, so I'm going to put the half spacer in first, add in my blade, and then add on the other spacers on top. I really like that you have the option of putting the blade up higher if you want, more clearance at the bottom from the bottom of your tumbler to where your vinyl starts. But I typically like to do as less as possible, just exposing a tiny bit of that stainless. So I really like that she has this half spacer on here. So once I have that on, I'm going to take my vinyl and wrap it all the way around my tumbler. Expose a little bit of the sticky part of our vinyl by trimming off a tiny bit of that backing. I'm not going to be particular on the placement of my seam. I just want to make sure that this entire tumbler is going to be covered with this vinyl. So once I make sure of that, I'm just going to press that exposed sticky down and work my way around the tumbler, pressing the vinyl down as I am removing the backing. Once I have that wrapped all the way around, I'm going to grab my tumbler holder or stand from Kimmy Page Boutique as well and put a piece of painter's tape over top, or in the center rather, of my seam and trim down with my craft knife. Now since we have a little bit of overhang on the top and the bottom with our vinyl, just trim that with some scissors so that whenever you do remove the vinyl that is underneath your seam, it doesn't rip that and cause it to rip down onto the tumbler. Press your seam back down really well, trim off any of that excess. It doesn't have to be perfect because we are again going to use our vinyl trimmer. I just like to trim it off so that it doesn't bunch up whenever I press it down onto the tool. I'm going to take my tumbler and press it down onto the tool and up to the blade, applying that consistent pressure and just spinning it around. Just when you're working with vinyl, make sure that you do not press it against the other exposed side because it can scratch your vinyl. So when you're applying pressure, just keep that pressure on the bottom of the tumbler and on the blade and not the side of the tool. And you get the most perfect edge around the top and bottom of your vinyl. I've done this before in a couple other tutorials, and I really like showing y'all how unique the Steel Magnolia tumblers are. They are the only tumblers that I'm aware of that you can remove the bottom and it does not compromise the performance of your tumbler. This gives you an opportunity to put lots of different cute things in the bottom of the tumbler. It makes it unique and really helps your design stand out. So to do that, I just took a tiny little screwdriver, put it along the seam of that bottom, tapped it with a hammer, and it usually just makes an indentation, and you can just put some pressure on there and pop it right off. Then I just taped off the bottom of my vinyl to avoid getting any paint on there, and painted the stainless portion of the bottom with black COLORFLEX paint. I did 2 thin coats so I can get nice even coverage down in those crevices, and just dried that up with my heat gun on low heat setting. Once I finished that second coat, I did remove the tape before it dried completely. I gave that about 30 minutes to dry and then moved into adding on our first coat of epoxy. So in our epoxy, I'm going to add Filter from COLORFLEX. This is an ultra fine, super sparkly glitter. It is perfect to add into your epoxy, especially when going over solid colors or vinyl like this that you want to add some dimension and sparkle to. And I did slow it down here just so you could see how sparkly it made this vinyl without taking away from the pattern. I popped that onto my turner, and while we are waiting for that to dry, I'm going to go ahead and get started on the dome lid. So there's a little rubber piece that is in the center for your straw. Pop out that little rubber piece and sand around the lid with a low grit sandpaper just to rough up the surface a little bit. I try to avoid the little indentation that's between the lid and that little lip that goes all the way around the outside, simply for the fact that I don't paint that and I do not put rhinestones on it. You absolutely can. It's just the look that I prefer. So after I have sanded this, I did go in with a 60 grit first, and then I followed up with a 400 grit sandpaper just to smooth out some of it, but make sure that it did have enough texture to really grab a hold of my paint and my rhinestone glue. So I did 2 very thin coats of the black COLORFLEX paints. Once again, I don't want my paint to be clumpy or like gloopy in areas. I want my glue to still be able to get down in those grooves and grab a hold of the plastic on this lid. So since we are going for sort of like a witchy, bubbly kind of drip, we're going to add in some half pearls as well as rhinestones. For our half pearls, we're using black half pearls from PDP Creative Studio in 10, 8, and 6 millimeter. And we're going to make sure that it sparkles by adding in obsidian rhinestones, also from PDP Creative Studio. We're using SS20, SS16, and SS6. This little tool is also from PDP Creative Studio, as well as my Liquid Fusion and my rhinestone pen. I just spread out a thin layer of Liquid Fusion with my silicone tool and then added all of my stones to a tray so I can easily grab them with my rhinestone tool and add them to the lid. Now we're going to start at the top around the straw hole. That's going to be our first focus. Then we're going to go around the bottom rim and fill in the center. And when adding on my rhinestones, my biggest focus is to avoid having as much negative space as possible. I want these rhinestones to really be packed in so there's not any space in between them. That's where your SS6 and SS4 rhinestones really come in handy. I will say though, once you use one of those tiny stones, you'll have to use a couple more. So I do try to avoid using a ton of those tiny rhinestones and focus more on trying to pack in those larger ones as tight as possible. Once you have made it all the way around that circle at the top, then it is time to add on your rhinestones around the bottom portion. Now the reason that I do this is because if you start in the center or if you do random spots, it is really difficult to get your stones flush with the hole at the top and the rim at the bottom. So going around those edges first really saves you a lot of headache and a lot of time trying to find the perfect stones to get them to fit flush, and in most cases you will not be able to get them to. It is way easier to find stones to fill in the center of your project. So just make sure you are working in small sections. I didn't mention this earlier, but the liquid fusion does dry quickly. So I'm only working in maybe 1 square inch sections when doing a cluster in the center, and around the sides I'm only putting 1 to 2 inches of glue where I want to apply my stones so it doesn't dry up really quick on me. And once I finished doing the top and the bottom, if I'm working on a tumbler, then it will be the top and the bottom rim. So once I finished doing both of those sections, then I do give it about 30 minutes to dry so that whenever I add in my stones through the center, I'm not going to move any of the stones I placed around my edges. Again, I allowed that top and bottom to dry for about 30 minutes so they would not move around when I started adding in the stones in the center, and just worked in small sections and filled that center area in. Now you can use a fast set epoxy for this. I will be using the Artistry 1:1 ratio for the bottom side of this tumbler. However, I have found that my stones slide or move around in places that I don't want them to go if I use a fast set for a tumbler or a dome lid like this. Unless, of course, I allow it to set up just a little bit, and then I don't have a tremendous amount of work time and constantly have to mix more. So I just prefer to use liquid fusion to apply my stones to these dome lids and tumblers. Once you have filled in the entire dome lid, then it is time to go around the edge. SS16 stones fit perfectly around the edge of this dome lid. I'm going to take a little bit of my liquid fusion once again, work in smaller sections, and just add these stones on all the way around, trying to keep them as straight as possible. Once our dome lid is complete, just set that to the side very carefully and allow it to dry. You want to give it about 24 hours before you go in with a little scrub brush and some Dawn dish detergent. Give it a little scrub and all of those stones will shine up beautifully. For our bubbly drip, we're going to get that bubble texture by adding on the half pearls prior to doing our drip. So the way I'm doing that, I just have a little liquid fusion on a piece of paper, and I'm going to use the pointy end of my rhinestone tool to apply that glue in little dots. You can also use the liquid fusion bottle, except I cut the tip off way too far, so it comes out in huge globs. So we can't have that. Now, typically before you would add these on, you would add on your decal. However, I had an extreme issue with the decal that I put on this. I cut it probably 6 times because I was just so determined to get that specific decal on this tumbler. And I just said, you know what? I know where it's going to go. I'm going to go ahead and add on my pearls. So adding your decal on before doing this step will help you map out your tumbler a little bit better. You want to have these about 1 inch or more above your decal to allow some room for your epoxy to drip once you add that onto these beads. Alright, so once you have all of your beads on just in random places, then it is time to add on your decal. Give it about 30 minutes to dry before you try adding anything on so you don't move those beads around. Now, I did get this decal off, or this image off of Creative Fabrica. I will have it linked for y'all. However, it was just absolutely horrendous trying to cut with my Cricut machine. I do not suggest attempting it unless you really just love being anxious and stressed. It was awful. And even with all the effort that I put into this, because I'm stubborn and determined, I'll probably remove it and replace it with a different decal because I just see too many flaws in it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, typically you would add your decal on before you add on the half pearls. And following the decal, you can add on a layer of epoxy to protect your decal before adding on your half pearls and your drip. And for our drip, I am going to use Artistry's 1:1 ratio facet. I'm adding in black pearl mica from PDB Creative Studio, and I'm also going to add in purple glow powder from COLORFLEX. I didn't know if this would work considering I'm not using all of the glow purple. I just thought I would give it a try since it did give this sort of like a little bit of a purple shimmer when the light hits it a certain way. So anyway, once we have our micas mixed into our epoxy, I'm going to take a little bit of Nice and Thick from CC DIY and add that to my epoxy to help give it a smooth but thick consistency to add on my drip and not have the epoxy fall too far down my tumbler. Now, I did flash my mask before adding in this Nice and Thick, and you should have already had your mask on because working with epoxy, but in the case that you did not, make sure that you do have a respirator on when working with Nice and Thick. It is super hazardous if you breathe it in, and you want to make sure that you are protected before adding that into your epoxy and all those little particles float through the air. It does take a lot of that product to add to your epoxy to get a thicker consistency, so I just added a few scoops to help speed it up just a little bit and then set my epoxy to the side for a second so I can add on a little bit of black paint around the top rim of this so that when I add my epoxy on, and it thins a little bit at the top as it drips, you will not be able to see through it. After giving my epoxy a good 5 minutes or so to set up, again, this is a fast set that cures very quickly. I split it up into 2 different cups. The more volume that you have, or the more milliliters that you have mixed of epoxy, the quicker that it can cure in a cup. So anytime I'm doing a drip, I try to split my epoxy up into either 2 or multiple cups to help slow that process down a little bit so it doesn't end up flash curing as I'm trying to apply it to my tumbler. You are first going to go around that top rim really thick with this epoxy. Make sure that you're getting in between and over top of all of those half pearls. Once I had a thick layer of epoxy around the rim and the top portion of the half pearls, I stood my tumbler up so that the epoxy can start to fall down onto the others, and just sort of helped it a little bit by adding on more globs of epoxy on top of those pearls as it was dripping. After I had all of those half pearls covered, I allowed it to set for just a second, just a hot second, so that it can move on its own, and then went in with my heat gun on a low heat setting to help smooth it out and allow it to drip a little bit further. Since I did this a little bit backwards, I did go in with Quick Seal, also from Artistry Epoxy, and just added a teeny dab on top of my decal and sealed that decal in. I gave this 2 hours to dry, and then I moved in with a layer of epoxy. Now, some people will say epoxy over top of your drips. Some people will say do your drip very last. I personally like to epoxy over them. I have a fear of someone just hitting one of the drips on something and it popping off of a glossy tumbler. Sealing your drips in with a layer or 2 of epoxy will help avoid that because it does secure them to your tumbler. And I just did 2 very thin layers, especially around the drip, and it also helps shine them up. If there's any air bubbles or anything that popped up from any micro bubbles that may have been in your epoxy, this will help seal those in and give it a nice smooth finish. Make sure around your drips that you go in with like the tip of your finger, or you can use a silicone tool, and get any globs of epoxy away from that, so that whenever you do go over with your torch, you're not missing any micro bubbles that may be trapped in globs of epoxy around your drips. After my fast set epoxy dried for about 30 minutes, I added on a second layer and then gave that 2 hours to dry before beginning the rhinestones on the bottom. So we are going to add in pure black to our 1:1 ratio facet epoxy. This pure black glitter from COLORFLEX does have sparkle under epoxy, so I decided to use that to fill in that little gap around the outer rim of the bottom of our tumbler and add a tiny bit there in the center to help adhere our rhinestones. You want a very, very thin layer of epoxy to adhere your rhinestones. I actually ended up taking some of this out of the center of this so it wouldn't sort of flood or go over my rhinestones. And then I just used that same mixture that we used for the dome lid and applied that to the bottom. Now, I know that I sped up adding the rhinestones on the lid and the bubble for our drip. This tutorial would have been 2 hours long if I had not even at a double time. This is still sped up ×2, but I will allow it to play through so that you can see how I really push those rhinestones together and fill in all of that negative space. Alright, and once you have finished your bottom, again, give that about 24 hours to dry. Scrub it with a little scrub brush and some Dawn dish detergent, and it will shine those stones right up. I was so excited that this tumbler did in fact glow. I was really skeptical and didn't think it would, since I was mixing so little of the purple glow in with a lot of the black mica, but hey, it did work and it looks pretty awesome. I hope that y'all have enjoyed this tutorial. I know it was a little lengthy, but I wanted to pack as much information in as I possibly could to help you make a successful bubble drip tumbler. If you have any questions, just drop them in the comments below and I will answer them as quickly as possible. As always, all the materials that I have used will be listed in the description below, as well as some coupon codes for y'all. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. That is all for today. Thank you all so much, and we will see you next time.